Imagine the weight of being hunted by an entire army, surrounded by enemies from all sides. Now, picture the fear running through the veins of the most notorious outlaw gang in Brazil. In 1926, as the Cangaceiros faced their most perilous moment, the gang that had once struck terror into the hearts of the powerful was on the brink of total annihilation. What was left of their strength, their unity, was beginning to fray. But something in the air changed. Something nobody expected. This wasn't just another fight. It was the battle that could end them all. Lampiao and his band of outlaws, the feared Cangaceiros, were cornered, running low on supplies and pushed to the brink of despair. Forces from the Brazilian government had tightened their noose, and betrayal was brewing within the gang itself. Despite their brutal tactics and legendary resilience, even the Cangaceiros were not invincible. It looked like the end for Brazil's most feared outlaw brotherhood. But then, in the midst of this crisis, a single question began to hang in the air. Who would save them? Lampiao was a ruthless leader, known for his cruelty and cunning, but it was someone else who would bring the light of survival into their darkened world. It was Maria Bonita, the woman who had stood beside him through thick and thin, who would become the unlikeliest of strategists. How did she manage to save the Cangaceiros from their impending doom? The answer is not only about courage or strength, it's about the brilliance of strategy. While others saw only chaos, Maria Bonita saw a path through the storm. In the heart of despair, she saw opportunity. Before the Cangaceiros would finally fall to their enemies, Maria Bonita would outsmart them all. Her story is one of intelligence, sharp wit, and the power of knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. As you're about to discover, Maria Bonita wasn't just the woman who stood beside Lampiao. She was the mind behind one of the most brilliant tactical moves in the history of the Cangaceiros. But before we dive deeper into her strategy, let me ask you this. What do you think it takes to survive when the odds are stacked so high against you? You'll be surprised by what Maria Bonita did. But before we move forward, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to make a strategic decision in the face of danger? Leave a comment below and let me know what you would have done in her shoes. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're intrigued by how one woman turned the tide of history for Brazil's most feared outlaws, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on more incredible stories from the darkest chapters of history. Stay with me, because what's coming next could change how you see the world of the Cangaceiros forever. In a world where outlaws were expected to be ruthless men, Maria Bonita stood out not just for her beauty, but for her unparalleled strength and wisdom. It's easy to overlook the women who fought beside the Cangaceiros, given how history often forgets their names, overshadowed by the fierce reputation of the men. But Maria Bonita was no mere She was the heartbeat of the Cangaco, the beating pulse that kept the gang from falling into disarray. Born in the harsh conditions of the Brazilian backlands, Maria Bonita had already learned early on that survival wasn't just about strength, it was about strategy. From a young age, she witnessed the brutality of the world around her, a world where women were often silenced, oppressed, and forgotten. But Maria refused to be a victim. She didn't just fight to survive, she fought to define her own fate. She met Lampiao when she was just 20 years old, but it wasn't love at first sight. Maria Bonita was no damsel in distress. She was a woman of resourcefulness and fierce independence. She didn't need anyone to fight for her. Instead, she brought an element to the gang that no one could have anticipated when Lampiao's gang was at its most vulnerable. It was Maria who not only held the group together but began strategizing how they could survive the overwhelming military presence hunting them down. While the Cangaceiros were known for their brutal tactics, raiding villages, stealing supplies, and using fear to maintain their dominance, Maria Bonita saw something more. She saw the flaws in their tactics, the missteps that could lead to their demise. And unlike Lampiao, who was often driven by emotion and pride, Maria kept a level head, considering every move with a strategist's precision. Her presence wasn't just about the physical battles they fought. It was about changing the way the Cangaceiros approached the war they were losing. She began to make calculated moves, ensuring the gang never became predictable. Her tactics often involved moving in ways that confused their enemies, striking unexpectedly, and then disappearing into the vast terrain of the circle. While the military chased shadows, Maria Bonita was ensuring the survival of the very people they sought to destroy. It was clear that Maria Bonita was more than just the wife of Brazil's most feared outlaw. She was the mind behind the plan. The architect of survival, she quickly became one of the few figures in the Cangaco who understood that the battle for survival wasn't always fought with guns. It was fought in the mind, in the ability to outwit an enemy who thought they could predict every move. Her ability to see what others couldn't was a rare gift. She understood the power of alliances, knew when to retreat, and when to make a stand. Through her, the Cangaceros learned the importance of patience, timing, and striking when their enemies were least prepared. Maria wasn't just trying to outfight the authorities, she was trying to outthink them. But what makes Maria Bonita's story even more captivating is the way she was able to earn the respect of her fellow Cangaceros. Didn't follow her out of fear. They followed her because they believed in her intellect and her vision. They knew she was their key to surviving another day, another week, and maybe even another year. What's more intriguing is that, in a world dominated by men and their often brutal way of thinking, Maria Bonita never tried to fit in. She didn't try to prove herself as one of the men. She simply did what needed to be done, and in doing so, became the kind of woman who could stand toe-to-toe with the most feared men of the Cangaco and demand they respect her for what she brought to the table. But Maria's role in this story is only beginning. In the next chapter, we'll explore how she transformed from a mere survivor into a mastermind, and how her intelligence became the secret weapon that saved the Cangaceros from complete annihilation. Maria Bonita's role in the Cangaco wasn't just about standing by her man. It was about transforming a band of outlaws on the verge of destruction into a well-oiled machine of resistance. While Lampiao may have been the face of the Cangaceros, it was Maria who saw the big picture and recognized the essential shift that needed to happen for their survival. At a time when the Cangaceros were surrounded, cornered by both the relentless military forces and a wave of internal betrayal, Maria Bonita's mind became their greatest weapon. While her husband, Lampiao, fought with fire and fury, Maria approached the struggle with precision, using a mindset that few would have expected from a woman in her position. In fact, many of her male counterparts initially underestimated her, seeing her as little more than a figure. But this was a grave mistake, one that would almost cost them everything. What made Maria Bonita's strategy so genius was her ability to think beyond brute force. She knew that their continued existence as a band of outlaws relied not only on fighting skill, but on outthinking their enemies. Every move she made was calculated, a chess move in a game with the highest stakes imaginable. Her primary goal wasn't just survival, it was to reshape the entire narrative of the Cangaceros from being simply feared bandits to being cunning, elusive, and nearly invincible. Her first major strategic move came when she convinced the Cangaceros to abandon traditional methods of fighting. They could no longer afford to be predictable, no longer able to afford to fight open battles in the open, where the military could target them easily. Maria suggested they use their greatest advantage to their intimate knowledge of the terrain. The vast, uncharted Sertão was their domain, a place where their enemies were out of their element, and Maria knew how to use it to her advantage. Instead of just running from the military, the Cangaceros would become the hunters. Maria suggested they begin ambushing their enemies with guerrilla tactics, appearing and disappearing from the military's radar in ways that seemed almost supernatural. The military, which was used to chasing shadows, found itself at a disadvantage. They didn't know how to predict where the Cangaceros would strike next. This tactical shift wasn't just about striking fear into their enemies, it was about making the military doubt their own strategies, making them question whether they could ever truly defeat the Cangaceros. The psychological aspect of this approach was brilliant. By forcing the military to question their own competence, Maria Bonita ensured that her gang wasn't just a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. They became an existential threat to the military's belief in their own invincibility. But the strategy didn't stop there. Maria Bonita also understood the importance of alliances. While Lampiao was known for his aggressive, all-or-nothing approach. Maria recognized that sometimes survival meant making allies of those who could be of use. She worked tirelessly to strengthen relationships with local populations, particularly those in towns who feared the government's reach as much as the Cangaco. She helped them understand that the gang wasn't their enemy, they were simply a force fighting against a common oppression. This strategy of forging alliances rather than creating enemies was something that other outlaw groups never understood. Most bandit groups resorted to fear and violence, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. But Maria Bonita's ability to think politically, to recognize the bigger picture of collective resistance, made her tactics incredibly effective. She was securing their future, not just through force, but through strategy, diplomacy, and clever psychological warfare. Maria's genius didn't just lie in her ability to survive, she had a vision for what the Cangaceros could become, and more importantly, how they could outlive their worst enemies. By recognizing the strategic importance of their surroundings, using psychological warfare, and creating alliances, Maria Bonita turned the tables on the military. Her strategies would become the blueprint for how the Cangaceros survive in a world determined to destroy them. Her tactical mind allowed the Cangaceros to survive for years longer than anyone ever expected. In a world dominated by men, where violence and fear were the primary tools of survival, Maria Bonita brought something new to the table in time. She was able to elevate her gang to a level of strategic brilliance that the military couldn't match. And even more remarkably, she did all of this while being a woman in a world that didn't believe women could lead. What Maria Bonita's strategy proves is simple. Strength is not just about muscle or power, it's about intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to think ahead of your enemies. Maria understood that power was a tool, and she wielded it with a skill few others could match. But what does this mean for the future of the Cangaceros? How would her strategies continue to shape the fate of the gang in their ongoing battle for survival? The next chapter in Maria Bonita's story reveals just how far she was willing to go to outwit her enemies and save her people. What makes Maria Bonita's strategy stand out isn't just her cunning tactics on the battlefield, it's her deep understanding of one crucial aspect of warfare that many overlook: the power of the mind. While most leaders relied on brute force and violence to instill fear, Maria saw something more profound: the ability to manipulate the enemy's psychology. Her most brilliant moves didn't involve the sword or gun. They involved exploiting the weaknesses in the minds of those who were hunting her gang. You see, one of the greatest weapons in war is fear, and Maria Bonita understood that better than anyone. She knew that while the military might have the numbers, the equipment, and the power, they didn't have the one thing that could defeat them: certainty. The Cangaceros' biggest advantage wasn't their firepower, it was their ability to stay unpredictable, to control the narrative, and to undermine the military's sense of control. Maria's approach to psychological warfare started with the way she shaped her own band of outlaws. Instead of relying on chaos, she instilled discipline, structure, and most importantly, loyalty. But she didn't just train them to fight, she trained them to think. The Cangaceros knew that their survival didn't just depend on fighting hard, but on staying one step ahead of their enemies. This level of training, where tactics and psychology merged, would go on to be their greatest weapon in a war they couldn't win with force alone. But the brilliance of Maria's strategy didn't stop there. She recognized that the government forces were not just a physical enemy, they were an ideological one. They believed in their power, in their divine right to crush the Cangaceros. They didn't fear the gang. They saw them as an obstacle to be removed. But Maria turned this belief into a weakness. She began planting seeds of doubt. In every encounter with the military, she made sure to leave behind signs of their presence, but in a way that confused their pursuers. Footprints that led nowhere, sudden ambushes that disoriented the soldiers, and then disappearances that seemed almost magical. The soldiers were no longer sure whether they were chasing the Cangaceros or merely shadows. They started questioning their own competence. Every failed pursuit chipped away at their confidence, and as their doubt grew, so did their fear. Maria also understood the importance of creating an aura of invincibility around her gang. She encouraged stories to spread about the Cangaceros, stories that made them seem larger than life, almost mythical. They weren't just a group of outlaws, they were ghosts who could slip in and out of the military's grasp with the cunning of foxes. These stories weren't based on truth, but they fed the fear and uncertainty within the military ranks. The more terrified the soldiers became, the less effective they were in pursuing the Cangaceros. But Maria's manipulation of the enemy's mind didn't end with her own tactics. She also understood that by controlling information, she could manipulate the way the Cangaceros were perceived, even among the local population. While most bandit groups relied on brute intimidation to rule over towns, Maria used diplomacy and subtlety. She made sure the people saw the Cangaceros as protectors, not oppressors, offering help to those who were most oppressed by the government forces. She knew that if the local population believed in their cause, they would provide support, shelter, and information. This led to a much-needed psychological advantage. The local population became allies of the Cangaceros, and when the military would march into a village, they found that the people weren't just neutral, they were hostile to the military, protecting the outlaws and ensuring their survival. The Cangaceros no longer had to fight alone. They had the entire community backing them. Maria Bonita's strategy turned the Cangaceros into more than just a gang of criminals. They became a symbol of defiance, and that symbol was more dangerous than any weapon. She knew that no army, no matter how well equipped, could defeat an enemy that didn't just fight, but made them question everything they knew. And that's exactly what she made. The military questioned their own authority and their own belief in victory. In the end, Maria's brilliance wasn't just in her tactics, it was in her understanding of the human mind. She didn't rely on force alone. She made her enemies doubt themselves, fear the unknown, and question their own beliefs. This was psychological warfare at its finest, and Maria Bonita was its master. But what did this all mean for the future of the Cangaceros? Could Maria's psychological tactics turn the tide in their battle against the government forces, or would the military eventually outwit her? The next part of this story will reveal just how far Maria would go in using her sharp mind to protect her people and how her actions would define the future of the Cangaceros. Maria Bonita wasn't just a woman in the world of the Cangaceros. She became the embodiment of strategy, resilience, and brilliance. She wasn't just another member of Lampiao's outlaw gang. She was the force that transformed the very structure of the Cangaco, elevating it from a violent band of rebels to a well-coordinated resistance movement that outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and survived against overwhelming odds. As the wife of Lampiao, Maria Bonita could have easily faded into the background, a mere shadow of the man who is the public face of the Cangaceros. But instead, she did something that few would have expected. She took control, shaped the gang's survival tactics, and became a legend not just for her association with Lampiao, but for her own contributions that were far more profound than anyone could have imagined. Maria was no ordinary woman. Born in the heart of Brazil's backlands, she lived a life full of hardship, and those experiences gave her the strength and wisdom that would later shape the future of the Cangaceros. From the moment she joined Lampiao's gang, she proved that she wasn't just capable of surviving in a man's world, she could thrive in it. But what made Maria Bonita esse legacy truly legendary wasn't just her ability to survive, it was her ability to lead. While the Cangaceros were primarily known for their acts of violence and intimidation, Maria Bonita had an entirely different approach. She understood that, in order to stay ahead of their enemies, the Cangaceros couldn't afford to follow the same tactics that had been used for centuries. They had to innovate, to change the way they fought and survived. Maria became the strategic mastermind behind the gang's evil. In a world where survival was determined by the ability to outsmart the government forces, she redefined what it meant to be an outlaw. The traditional bandit model, based on open violence and brute force, was no longer enough to outlast the growing military opposition. Maria understood this better than anyone, which is why she began to build a strategy rooted in misdirection, psychological manipulation, and calculated strikes. Her efforts to create a decentralized structure within the Cangaceros allowed them to be more fluid, more adaptable. The gang no longer fought in a conventional sense. Instead, they became an elusive force, striking swiftly and disappearing before their enemies could catch up. Maria Bonita turned the gang into a highly mobile unit that used guerrilla tactics to disorient the military and make them feel like they were always a step behind. But Maria's influence extended beyond just the battlefield. She knew that the Cangaceros had to be more than just an outlaw band, they had to be a symbol. She understood that in order to inspire fear and loyalty, the Cangaceros needed to be seen as more than a mere gang of criminals. They had to become a force of resistance, a symbol of defiance against the corrupt government that oppressed the people. Maria Bonita's legacy was defined by her ability to create this image, to transform the Cangaceros into a larger-than-life force that could not be easily destroyed. She inspired her comrades with her intelligence and her unwavering determination to stand against oppression. And in doing so, she became a figure who transcended the world of outlaws. She wasn't just an icon for the Cangaceros, she became a symbol of resistance for the Brazilian people. Through Maria, the Cangaceros became a beacon of hope for the oppressed. While the military and the government forces sought to destroy them, Maria's genius was in making the Cangaceros impossible to defeat. Every time they thought they had cornered them, every time they believed they were on the verge of wiping them out, Maria would pull the strings behind the scenes and turn the tide in her favor. Her legacy went beyond her time with the After the fall of the gang, her name lived on in the stories of the people. She wasn't just remembered as a woman who stood beside her husband, she was remembered as the woman who saved the Cangaceros from certain defeat, the woman whose strategy and intelligence kept the gang alive long after they should have been wiped out. Maria Bonita's name became synonymous with strength, strategy, and survival in the face of overwhelming odds. Her story is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest strength isn't physical, it's mental. Maria Bonita's intelligence and strategic brilliance were the keys to the Cangaceros' survival, and her legacy would go on to inspire generations of Brazilians, especially women, who saw in her a model of resilience and tactical genius. But what did her success mean for the future of the Cangaceros? Could her leadership alone have kept them alive, or was there something else at play? In the next chapter of this story, we'll dive deeper into the lasting impact Maria Bonita had on the Cangaceros and how her brilliance ensured that her legacy would never be forgotten. In the world of the Cangaceros, survival wasn't just about combat or strategy, it was about ritual. The Cangaco wasn't just a way of life, it was a code, a set of practices and beliefs that kept the band of outlaws grounded in a world filled with chaos and uncertainty. These rituals were as much a part of their survival as their weapons, as much a part of their identity as their gang's name. Maria Bonita wasn't just the strategist who kept them one step ahead of the military. She was deeply embedded in the rituals that defined the Cangaceros' way of life. The outlaws followed a strict code that governed everything from their daily routines to their interactions with the local population and, most importantly, their battles. But these weren't just traditional outlaws following the lead of a charismatic leader. They were part of a brotherhood, bound by a unique set of customs that forged an unbreakable bond between them. Rituals in the Cangaco weren't just for show, they had deep psychological and symbolic meanings that played a crucial role in keeping the gang together and ensuring their resilience. Take, for example, the gang SE strict rules about loyalty and discipline. Every Cangacero had to live by the same principles, and breaking these rules could lead to harsh punishment or even death. This harsh discipline reinforced the idea that survival depended on absolute loyalty to the group and their cause. But there was more to it than just enforcing loyalty. The rituals of the Cangaceros also helped them maintain a sense of control in a world that constantly sought to break them. These rituals included practices that not only shaped their identity as outlaws, but also connected them to a larger, almost mystical purpose. Whether it was the sacred songs they sang during their travels, the way they conducted their ambushes, or the ceremonies that marked their victories, the rituals created a sense of belonging that was critical for the survival of the gang. For instance, before every battle, the Cangaceros would gather in a circle, often led by Lampiao or Maria Bonita, and recite prayers or chant songs that symbolized their unity and strength. This wasn't just a form of religious devotion, it was a psychological tool, reinforcing their belief in themselves and their mission. The chants, often laced with themes of defiance and victory, became a ritual that reinforced their identity as outlaws warriors in a fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Maria Bonita, in particular, understood the significance of these rituals. As a woman in a male-dominated world, she knew that the Cangaceros needed more than just weapons. They needed to be emotionally and mentally prepared for the struggles ahead. The rituals, therefore, served not only as a means of survival, but also as a psychological armor, a way to maintain focus and keep morale high when the situation seemed impossible. In addition to these pre-battle rituals, there were also ceremonies that marked significant events in the Cangacero's journey. For example, when a Cangacero was killed in battle, the gang didn't just bury him quietly. They held a ceremony to honor him, celebrating his bravery and sacrifice. This wasn't just about paying tribute, it was a way of reinforcing the idea that the Cangaceros were a brotherhood, united in their fight and their beliefs. Every death was a reminder of their shared mission, and these rituals kept the gang united, even in the face of tragedy. These rituals weren't just for the Cangaceros, they also played a role in their relationship with the local population. The Cangaceros, once seen as mindless killers by the people in the backlands, they were seen as something more complex. The rituals they performed, the songs they sang, and the way they interacted with the locals gave them a sense of legitimacy. The people began to see them not just as criminals, but as a symbol of resistance, fighting back against a corrupt government that oppressed them. Maria Bonita, through her intelligence and understanding of human nature, knew how to leverage these rituals to her advantage. While the military viewed the Cangaceros as nothing more than bandits, Maria used the power of ritual to transform them into symbols of defiance. She understood that these rituals not only kept the gang intact, they also allowed them to inspire fear and respect in equal measure. This psychological manipulation wasn't just about the outlaws controlling their own minds, it was about manipulating the minds of everyone around them. The rituals created a mystique, a sense of power that made the more than just a gang of rebels. They became a force to be reckoned with, a group bound by traditions that made them feel unstoppable, no matter how many enemies they faced. In many ways, the rituals of the Cangaceros were what kept them going in the darkest of times. When defeat seemed inevitable, they could turn to their rituals, reaffirming their purpose and their resolve. They were more than just outlaws, they were part of something larger than themselves, a movement fueled by traditions that tied them together in ways that few outside the group could understand. Maria Bonita's involvement in these rituals was crucial to the survival of the Cangaceros. Her ability to lead, to inspire, and to connect the gang's rituals to their ongoing battle for survival was what made her such a formidable force in the Cangaco world. Her influence wasn't just in her strategic genius, it was in the way she understood the power of belief, of ritual, and of tradition. As the Cangaceiros found themselves facing an increasingly overwhelming military presence, one might think that their fate was sealed. The government forces had marshaled all their resources, hundreds of soldiers, advanced weaponry, and an unwavering determination to crush the outlaw band once and for all. But this is where the brilliance of Maria Bonita came to the forefront. In the darkest hour of the Cangaceros, when everything seemed lost, it was Maria who made the strategic move that would shift the balance of power and ensure their survival for a little longer. The military had finally tracked them down. The Cangaceros were cornered in a remote part of the Sertão, an arid desert landscape that seemed to offer no hope of escape. The army had surrounded them, cutting off all routes of retreat. Desperation began to settle in among the gang members, and even Lampiao, usually so confident in his ability to fight his way out of any situation, began to lose hope. This was the moment when Maria's cunning strategy would turn the tide in their favor. Maria understood something that the military didn't. When you're dealing with a force as unpredictable as the country, you can't win through brute force alone. To survive, they needed to outwit their enemies, to make the military question their own competence and waste their resources in futile attempts to capture them. Maria's strategy wasn't just about fighting. It was about making the military fight a battle they could never win. With the gang surrounded, Maria saw an opportunity to turn the military's own tactics against them. She ordered her group to split into smaller, more agile units. Each unit would take on a different route, using the cover of the desert terrain to move quickly and confuse the soldiers. The military, expecting a large-scale confrontation, was ill-prepared for the Cangacero's sudden disappearance and reappearance. In a sense, Maria turned the landscape into their greatest weapon. The army, bogged down by their own strategies, was caught off guard by the Cangacero's ability to strike without warning and vanish just as quickly. But it wasn't just about avoiding capture, it was about exhausting the enemy's resources. The Cangaceros began launching small, coordinated attacks on the military's supply lines. They didn't engage in full battles, but instead picked off isolated targets and ambushed smaller groups of soldiers. With each skirmish, the military's morale began to erode. Supplies were dwindling. The soldiers were exhausted, and worst of all, they were losing confidence. The more the military pushed, the more they realized they were fighting a ghost army, an enemy that seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish into the landscape without a trace. The psychological effect was devastating. The Cangaceros, led by Maria's strategic brilliance, weren't just surviving, they were making the military feel incompetent. This constant uncertainty, the constant fear of attack, wore down the government forces in a way that no direct confrontation could have. They were no longer fighting a well-defined enemy. They were fighting shadows, fighting an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they did. Maria didn't just outwit the military with her tactics, she manipulated their entire perception of the conflict. By playing on their fear and confusion, she turned what should have been their moment of victory into their greatest failure. What began as a desperate attempt to eliminate the Cangaceros became a drawn-out and increasingly hopeless campaign, with the military growing more frustrated by the day. At the peak of this conflict, when the government forces believed they were on the verge of wiping out the Cangaceros for good, Maria Bonita's strategy had already achieved its goal: survival. The Cangaceros may not have been able to defeat the military in open battle, but they had succeeded in making the military doubt its own strength and question its ability to ever truly win. Maria's brilliance was not just in her ability to plan tactical strikes, it was in her understanding of the human mind. She knew that the military's greatest weakness was their own arrogance. They believed they could crush the Cangaceros with their superior numbers and firepower. But Maria understood that sometimes victory isn't about overpowering your enemy. It's about making them defeat themselves, and that's exactly what she did. As the military retreated, their morale shattered, and their supplies depleted, Maria Bonita's reputation grew even more formidable. She wasn't just an outlaw's wife, she had proven herself to be a brilliant strategist, capable of outsmarting the might of Brazil's military forces, and in that moment, she did more than just save her people. She solidified her place as one of the most legendary figures in the history of the Cangaceros. But what happened next? Did the military finally give up? Or did they come back with a new plan to hunt down the Cangaceros for good? The story doesn't end here. In the next chapter, we'll see how Maria Bonita's legacy continued to shape the future of the Cangaceros and how her genius ensured that they would live to fight another day. In the world of the Cangaceros, survival was never a guarantee. It wasn't just about outsmarting the military or outlasting enemy, for it was about the price each member of the gang had to pay to keep the group alive. Maria Bonita knew this better than anyone. Every victory, every step they took to stay one step ahead of their enemies came at a cost that would haunt her and the Cangaceros long after the battles had ended. While Maria Bonita's intelligence and strategic mind were central to the survival of the gang, there was another, darker reality that lay beneath the surface: the constant threat of betrayal. Loyalty was the backbone of the Cangaceros, yet it was also their greatest vulnerability. In a world where every decision could mean life or death, the pressure to survive sometimes led even the most trusted members of the gang to make choices that would threaten everything they fought for. Betrayal wasn't always a matter of choosing the enemy over the gang, it was often the result of fear, desperation, and the harsh realities of life as an outlaw. In the brutal world of the Cangaceros, it wasn't just the military they had to watch out for. The true enemy sometimes came from within. The price of loyalty was high, and in times of stress, fear, or temptation, Even the most faithful members could falter. But how did Maria Bonita navigate this treacherous world of internal threats? She used her ability to read people to sense who could be trusted and who was wavering. But even her keen instincts couldn't always prevent the inevitable betrayals that would tear at the heart of the Cangaco. The gang was often divided by personal conflicts, and as the pressure of living on the run took its toll, tensions between members grew. What started as a brotherhood of outlaws quickly became a fragile alliance, where personal interests and survival instincts sometimes led people to make deadly decisions. The most painful losses came not in battle, but in the moments when betrayal turned a member of the gang against their own. There were instances when men who had fought side by side with Lampiao and Maria Bonita, who had sworn their loyalty to the cause, suddenly turned their backs on the group, whether it was out of fear of capture, greed, or the promise of a pardon from the military. These betrayals left deep scars on the Cangaco, and in this unforgiving world, such actions were often met with brutal retribution, either from the gang itself or from the military, which was always eager to use traitors as informants. But the true cost of survival wasn't just about betrayals, it was about sacrifice. Maria Bonita, more than anyone, understood the sacrifices required to stay alive. The Cangaceiros didn't just sacrifice their freedom, they sacrificed their humanity. Every ambush, every raid, every day spent on the run chipped away at their sense of self. The further they went into the depths of the Sertão, the more they had to give up. Their lives, once full of possibility, became a series of grim choices, each one harder than the last. And the losses weren't just physical. The emotional toll of being constantly hunted, of living in a world where every friendship and bond could be shattered at any moment, was enough to break even the toughest of men. The Cangaceros had to learn to numb their emotions, to hide their pain behind a mask of toughness. But Maria Bonita, with her unshakable resolve, never let the weight of the gang's sacrifices crush her spirit. She knew that survival meant keeping a level head, staying focused on the bigger picture, even when the pain of loss threatened to overwhelm her. For Maria, the hardest part wasn't the bloodshed, it was the knowledge that survival sometimes meant watching the people she loved fall away. The Cangaceros weren't just her comrades. They were her family. Losing one of them, even for the greater good of the gang, was a sacrifice that she couldn't help but feel. She was forced to witness the death and betrayal of those who had fought beside her, and while she could bury her emotions and keep the group moving forward, the weight of it all wore on her. The loss of comrades was a constant companion for Maria Bonita, but she never allowed it to deter her. She understood that the fight wasn't just about the present, it was about the future of the Cangaceros. Every sacrifice, every betrayal, and every loss had a purpose, and Maria Bonita was determined to ensure that the Cangaceros would survive to fight another day. But at what cost? What happens when the sacrifices become too great? When the emotional toll is too much for even the strongest to bear? The next part of the story reveals the limits of survival and how Maria Bonita's resilience was tested in ways that would forever change her and the gang. As the days wore on, the inevitable began to settle in the Cangaco. Once a symbol of defiance and resistance, were nearing the end of their reign. The Brazilian military had grown stronger, their strategies more refined, and the once feared band of outlaws had become the hunters. The end of the Cangaco era seemed imminent, but even in the face of certain defeat, Maria Bonita's legacy would continue to echo throughout the land. In the final days of the Cangaceros, when many of the gang members began to lose hope, Maria remained as determined as ever. Her mind, always focused on the future, was already thinking beyond the survival of the Cangaceros. She knew that, even if the gang fell, her story needed to live on. It wasn't enough for her to be remembered as a mere outlaw. She needed to be remembered as someone who fought for a cause, someone who had defied the odds and changed the course of history. Maria's legacy wasn't just about tactics or battles, it was about the way she inspired those around her. In the end, when the gang was forced to surrender or face annihilation, it wasn't just the Cangaceros who mourned the loss of their Lorette, it was the people of the backlands who had come to see Maria Bonita as something more than a criminal. She had become a symbol of resistance, a figure who represented the fight against oppression. To the people, She was more than just the wife of Lampiao, she was a hero in her own right. Her influence reached beyond the Cangaco. She was the one who showed that women, too, could wield power in a world dominated by men. She had carved out her own space in history, not as a passive bystander, but as a leader in her own right. The way she navigated the brutal world of the Cangaceros, balancing the chaos of war with her own intelligence and grace, set her apart from others. She was a woman who defied the norms of her time, a woman whose legacy would not be erased. Even after the fall of the Cangaceros, Maria Bonita's story lived on in the collective memory of the people. In the rural towns where the Cangaceros had once fought, people continued to tell stories of Maria's brilliance, of her ability to outthink and outmaneuver even the most seasoned military strategists. She became an icon, a figure whose name was synonymous with intelligence, strength, and defiance. The stories of her survival and her leadership would be passed down through generations, ensuring that her legacy would never fade into the shadows of history. But what did this legacy mean for the future of the Cangaceros? Would the gang's demise spell the end of the resistance, or would Maria's legacy inspire future generations to take up arms against the government? The next chapter of the Cangaceros story reveals how Maria Bonita's influence lived on, even after the gang had been disbanded, and how her actions helped shape the future of resistance movements in Brazil. As the dust settled and the Cangaceros faded into history, one question remained. How could such a legendary group of outlaws, once feared across Brazil, meet their end in such a definitive way? The military had succeeded in crushing the Cangaceros, and their brutal reign over the backlands seemed over. But in the aftermath, one thing was certain: Maria Bonita's legacy was far from over. Despite the fall of the Cangaceros, Maria Bonita's story continued to live on in the hearts of the people. Her brilliance, her courage, and her unmatched intelligence made her a symbol of resistance that transcended the Cangaco era. For the generations that followed, she became more than just a legendary figure of the past. She became an icon of survival, a woman who had fought not just for her own life, but for the survival of an entire brotherhood. Maria's name became synonymous with the idea that even in the most oppressive circumstances, one person could change the course of history. Her legacy wasn't just about being a woman in a man's world. It was about how she became the very heart of the Cangaceros, the one person who could think strategically when others saw only violence. In a world that had written off women as secondary figures, Maria Bonita showed that a single woman's mind could be more powerful than an entire army. Her influence reached far beyond the days of the Cangaceros. Long after the gang was disbanded, the stories of Maria's genius continued to inspire future generations. She wasn't just a part of the Cangaceros' history, she became the key figure around which the entire narrative revolved. Even after their defeat, Maria Bonita's name would live on as a symbol of defiance, intelligence, and leadership in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Her role in the survival of the Cangaceros was more than just strategic, it was emotional. Maria Bonita had been the glue that held the gang together during its darkest hours. When the Cangaceros were surrounded by enemies, when defeat seemed inevitable, it was her leadership, her ability to think under pressure, and her unwavering loyalty to her people that gave them the strength to keep fighting. Without her, the Cangaceros might have fallen long before they actually did. Her story is a reminder that true leadership isn't just about wielding power, it's about using your mind, your heart, and your will to guide others through the most challenging circumstances. Maria Bonita's legacy didn't just end with her death. It lived on in the way the Cangaceros were remembered, in the way the people of Brazil viewed resistance and strength. Maria's brilliance wasn't just about tactics. It was about understanding the power of perception, of building a legacy that would outlast even the gang itself. While many saw her as just a woman standing beside a famous outlaw, Maria Bonita proved that her place in history was far more significant than that. She wasn't just the wife of Lampiao, she was the strategic mind that kept the Cangaceros alive. And her intelligence was the reason they survived as long as they did. As we reflect on the legacy of Maria Bonita, it's clear that her story is one of endurance, brilliance, and defiance. She was not just a participant in the history of the Cangaceros, she was the force that changed the course of that history. Her name will forever be remembered as one of the most intelligent, influential, and iconic figures of Brazil's outlaw history. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the Cangacero's world. Maria Bonita's story has shown us that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who fight with their minds, and her legacy is one that will continue to inspire for generations to come. Now, if you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating stories in Brazilian history, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below if Maria Bonita's strategy and legacy have changed the way you view leadership and survival. Don't forget to give this video a like if you found it insightful. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can stay updated on more incredible stories from the world of history. There's always more to discover, and I've got a video waiting for you right here that you want miss.